Well, welcome to the Disabuse Podcast, where we seek to prevent, detect, investigate, and eliminate abuse in churches and faith-based organizations. And please remember to like and subscribe. Today, we are joined by Mary DeMuth. Now, Mary is a literary agent, the host of the Pray Everyday podcast, and a prolific author of more than 50 books, including this book right here, We Too, How the Church Can Respond Redemptively to the Sexual Abuse Crisis. And that's the topic we're going to be talking about today. You can visit Mary online as well at marydemuth.com. So, Mary, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
Now, I want to give a bit of a warning to the viewer. We will be talking about some heavy topics today, including issues of sexual abuse and sexual violence. So I would invite everybody to please exercise self-care as you are watching this interview. So, Mary, we are going to be talking today about the church and the Me Too movement and matters of sexual abuse. But I wanted to begin with your personal story of abuse and redemption. Help us understand. You do not come to these questions in the abstract. You have gone through the dark night of the soul, the valley of the shadow of death, and you've come out the other side, and you bring us hope as well. So, could you begin by telling us a little bit of your story?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I wrote We Too, I realized that I had also been a victim of this whole story was trafficking and institutional protectionism. So I could go back to it in that way, although it wouldn't have necessarily been a church. So I was at 5 years old, and there was a babysitter, and she would allow me to go with these neighborhood boys every day during my kindergarten year. And of course, they were molesting me. And they would tell me things like they would kill my parents if I told anybody. And they threatened me and all of that. And this would go on day after day after day. And one of the gifts I think God gave me, I was not a Christian at the time, but I knew that what they were doing was wrong. And that is something that a lot of sexual abuse victims struggle with. They somehow think, oh, I must have brought this on myself. The little gift for me was I knew that they were bad and that this wasn't right. When they began, this was two boys, teenagers, when they began inviting their friends to join in, that's when I got up the nerve to tell the babysitter. And I remember telling her, and she said these beautiful but horrible words in retrospect. I will tell your mom, 5 words. And so the next day when I came to her house after kindergarten and ate my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and the knock came at the door again, but I was feeling peaceful, like they're not going to get to me because my mom knows. Well, she just shoved me outside again, and it just kept going on. And so that's where the institutional protectionism happened. She was trafficking me so that she wouldn't have to babysit me. And then she was protecting her institution by not telling my mom, because if she told my mom, then her institution, which there were other kids at the daycare, would be shut down. So eventually, a few days after that, I realized I had to take things into my own hands. And this is pretty sophisticated for a 5-year-old, but I decided that I would sleep. So I would get back from kindergarten, eat my sandwich, run into her bedroom. And thankfully, she just hated kids. And so if I was out of her hair, then that was the solution to her problem. And so I just pretended to sleep for 3, 4, 5 hours until my mom would pick me up. And that happened for that whole school year. And then we moved, and I was free from that. But I constantly throughout my life have been chased by predators and felt like I had a come get me sign on my forehead. And then my father, who my mom had divorced, was also a sexual predator and was incestual. And so there were 2 different aspects of sexual abuse. There was no safe place for me, whether with my mom or with my father. And that's the background of my story. The redemptive side, to jump over to that, is, as you can imagine, I was a very broken child. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. It was only a swear word. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know Jesus was associated with Easter or Christmas. And when I was in the 7th and 8th grade, I was ready to take my life because I didn't understand why I was on the earth. And God was very kind to send me a counselor in my junior high setting who I believe was a Christ follower. And he just saved my life by listening to me. And then as a freshman, I started to go to Young Life. And as a sophomore, I went to a weekend camp and heard the whole gospel and met Jesus there. And I've been on a long journey of complex trauma healing from that point on.
Wow. Uh, some years ago, there was a story in I think it was in Chile of somewhere in Latin America anyway, where there was a cave that fell in, and these miners that were stuck
Mhm.
underground for like 3 months or something crazy, and then they were finally rescued, and it was just told as the story of triumph that they were all brought out and saved. And then I watched a movie about it. And what impacted me about the movie was it wasn't all happy after they were saved. They had to continue to process the traumatic impact of having been stuck underground for so long. And the general lesson here actually brings me to a quote on page 152 of your book where you say, healing happens in layers,
Mhm.
which is this elegantly simple yet profound statement, I think. Can you unpack that further, both with respect to your own journey and also other people, how we sometimes have this very simplistic understanding of healing and reconciliation, some of these other big topics, that it's just this punctiliar thing. It's an event, but it's a process.
Yes, you get 5 gold stars for using Pontilier. That was great. I'll tell a story about that. So when I met Christ, I started to just begin that healing process. And then in college, I was fortunate enough to be in a community of people, even though I didn't go to a Christian school, there were Christians around me and they dared to believe that God would heal me. And so they laid their hands on me and they prayed for me for 4 years and I cried and a lot, like so many rivers of tears. But at the end of those 4 years, I was like, I'm done. I have healed. And I thought that was it. And so I got pretty angry after I got married when I had to face sex and had to face marriage and all of the complicated emotions associated with that. And then when I started having children and my first daughter turned 5, that's when I realized healing is layers, that it's not one and done and shove it down. It's one and then another and then another and then another. And I'm still healing. And I think I wish someone would have told me that when I began, because I was simplistically thinking, I was in a charismatic circle at that time, and that was like, okay, you're healed now. Like that's it. Not understanding the nature of trauma. And as I say to people, trauma is the gift that keeps on giving. It just when you least expect it, it will rear its ugly head and you will be triggered again. And that's a real bummer. But I can also say that the longer I heal and the longer I'm on this journey, the more whole I am, the more joyful I am, the more I'm able to help other people in their journeys. And so that's been a blessing.
How common is this problem of sexual abuse in the church today? We get the headlines. There was another headline just in the last week about a high-profile Texas pastor. How common is it? Do you have any sense of that?
I think it's very sadly, I think it's very common unless a church has really taken seriously child protective policies and has become informed in that. Because it's not the creeper that you have to watch out for. It is the charismatic person who kids hang on to and that knows where all the cameras are. I think a lot of us, I know I just recently left a mega church and I'm in a smaller church setting now, but the mega church would say, well, yeah, we've trained our workers, but we've got cameras everywhere, so we don't think about it. Well, they have no idea that 100% of grooming can happen under the watchful eye of a camera, and then they know where all the blind spots are. And a church is a really great place for a predator because we want to believe the best about everyone. I don't understand it. I read the book Predators, and it scared the heck out of me because I just don't get it. My father was a predator. I've spent years trying to understand who he was, and I just don't get it. And we tend to have a redemptive arc to our stories. So we want to even say, well, that sexual abuser who's preyed on children should, we believe in the gospel. He should be redeemed. And I would say, absolutely, he can be redeemed, but he should never be around children for the rest of his life. Just as an alcoholic should not frequent bars for the rest of their life. They should, and they shouldn't want to, because if they want to be better, they wouldn't put themselves in a situation of that. And so we need to become better informed, not rely on technology so much, and also trust our gut, but also understand that a predator looks like your next door neighbor who's really cool and kind.
Yeah. Now, I've investigated several cases that involved respondents with grooming behavior, and one of the things I've seen that is really chilling is that often it is like the parents or caregivers of the target who are most resistant to
Yeah,
participating in the investigation because no, how can you accuse this guy of
yeah,
this or think anything bad about him? Because what a groomer does is he doesn't just groom the target, he grooms the proximal authorities to the target.
yes, yes.
And one quick story as well in terms of the church and attracting predators. So one of the most infamous serial killers in Canadian history, his name is Clifford Olson. He was a child
Mhm.
serial killer, and a former colleague of mine attended the same church in the 1980s that Clifford Olson attended in Surrey, in the outskirts of Vancouver. And he said that Clifford Olson taught Sunday school and could quote scripture better than anybody probably in the church. So just an anecdote that churches are they're like fields for harvest for people who
Yes.
are predatory often.
Yeah,
So
that's true and hard. I hate hearing it, but it's true.
yeah, yeah. So Me Too came out, the hashtag went viral in 2017. Your book We Too came out a couple years later. I would say at that point we were kind of riding the crest of a wave of a new awareness of and intolerance about sexual abuse, particularly targeted to women and girls. Where are we at another 5, 6 years out from there in terms of the Me Too movement and the We Too or Church Too movement?
Yeah, I would say one positive is that we've included men in that,
Mm,
because I think that's a hard thing to talk about, but it's really important that we do talk about male victims. But the negative that's happened, I would say, particularly in the US, is, we have someone who's a fairly known sexual predator at the helm. And so there's been this backpedaling, and I've seen it in a lot of more reformed denominations, just to be very careful on my words here, but more male centric, more male dominated theologies, where this has kind of, for me personally, I have felt like we've stepped backwards, that there has been this whole thing about empathy being toxic. It's ridiculous. Um,
mm. Can you say
and
more about that? This idea of empathy being toxic?
I know it's so there's books about this in the US, and their main premise, and I understand it to a point, their main premise is that if you are empathetic to a prisoner who has abused somebody, then you're enabling their sin. So I understand that part. That totally makes sense to me.
Mhm.
But just making a blanket statement like that, it seems like they're taking it to a greater degree by saying that even just empathizing with someone in pain is toxic, which cannot be. Then
Mm.
we'd have to discount the Sermon on the Mount. We'd have to discount the way Jesus lived. I mean, it just doesn't fit with who he is. But in some of these, and this is being purported by some of these like more toxic-y masculinity doctrines, um, where women are seen this is on the extreme. I wouldn't say it's not, it's everywhere, but women are seen more as property, and they don't tend to view marital rape as a thing. And you have these closed church systems where, there's just no way to make an outcry, because usually the woman is blamed if she's 13 years old and she's wearing normal clothes, but they can blame her for being sexy or whatever. So there's these types of like high dominant systems where it becomes almost impossible. You almost have to escape the system. And we're seeing that also within the Amish and, that those tighter closed system, Mennonite systems. We're seeing a lot of people leave and then getting help for their sexual abuse and being able to kind of exegete their culture and why it was that way.
Okay. You mentioned, alluded to the President of the United States, I take it. I don't want to get political here, but I mean, he was found on the balance of probabilities to be an adjudicated sexual abuser in a civil proceeding. And the way that that fact is dismissed from people who have a particular party affiliation, I mean, it reminds me of the way that use of patterns in Jerry Sandusky's behavior were dismissed because he was the assistant coach. That you get the same kind of rationalizations. What is the kind of I don't know, the corrosive impact on the witness of the evangelical community? It's a big question, I guess. But when you sort of make this Faustian pact, of
Yeah.
for political and social influence.
Yeah, I would say that whether this president were a Democrat or a Republican, and let's say it was a Democrat that had that same kind of record against women, I would be just as alarmed.
Yeah.
And I think this dismissal is 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 terrible for sexual abuse victims, because what it communicates to the world is you can do whatever the heck you want. If you have money and power, and Sandusky's a really good example of that. People that have money and power can get away with harming others for years and years. First of all, because as you mentioned with the guy, in that memorized Bible verses and was preying on children, eventually, you can, if you have that power, you can appear a certain way, and everyone wants to I think this is kind of the question you're getting at. Everyone wants to be connected to power.
Mm.
Somehow we feel like if we're somehow connected to power, then we can be powerful as well. And my husband and I were having this conversation, and I was like, why do people want to connect to rich people? Because typically, and I'm not demonizing all rich people, but when you get to a certain level, almost all people in the billionaire range have exploited someone somehow. And yet somehow we have deified them. And that gets back to, and again, this is a little different than in Canada, but in America, the American dream, like the highest thing that you can do is be a self-made person, make a lot of money. Everyone wants to do it. And so when someone is there, you can dismiss all their bad behavior because the means, they're justified, and the ends will justify those means. The riches will justify, well, but look, I mean, he's successful. And I don't know, that's probably a very complicated answer to your question, but I think it's wrong. And I think that we as true Christ followers are in an upside down kingdom, but many of us are acting as if we're in a right side up kingdom where we need to be next to power in order to do God's work, which I have never seen that in the Bible. It's always the weak, the broken, the least, the last, the lost who are doing the work of God.
Yeah. I mean, somebody like Daniel or Joseph, where they do end up having proximity to power, it's not because they compromised, the exact
Right.
opposite, in fact.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I'm glad you brought that up because, in the business that I'm in, I'm a Christian author, and Um, I remember when I was on a plane to my first major Christian writers conference in 2003. And that was before I published 50 books. And so 0 books, and I'm on my way, and I have a vision, which I never do. And this vision was my whole life flashed before my eyes. And I said to the Lord, wow, I have endured a lot of trials, because that's true. You heard my story. And he said, yes. I sensed him say, yes, you have endured many trials, but will you endure the trial of notoriety? And that has stayed in my mind all these years and I've watched Christian authors fall, many of them, some of them being convicted last week, or not convicted, but arraigned, sold hundreds of thousands of copies of books, and fame is going to ruin a soul. So why is it that we still climb that ladder and we still try to have access to it?
Yeah, it's good warning. And I think that's a question. I think it's a question we'll have to continue to ask ourselves because it sneaks up on you, right? Like
It
I,
does.
I I remember reading about a Christian leader who was well known for attacking prosperity preachers. And then that individual was getting, it turned out, like $250,000 a year paid by his ministry as well as his golf membership. And I'm like, that didn't happen overnight, right? It was like
Yeah.
it slowly every year they would agree, the board would vote to boost his salary and that. And so I think it kind of sneaks up on you, and that just makes it even more insidious. Now, there is a perception often that kind of justifies or rationalizes the skepticism of the person who brings forth the complaint, and that is that there are a lot of false complaints. And of course, there can be a false complaint, but I think the statistic you give in the book is something like 6% of
Mhm.
complaints turns out are false. Can you say a little bit more about that and about how seriously we should take people when they do bring forth a complaint of sexual abuse?
We definitely need to err on the side of belief, and that 6% can help us do that. And that's why having investigators is really important, because it's not your job to figure out the veracity of the claim. It's to go to the authorities, particularly if the person is under 18. You have to, at least here in the US, you have to. And you have to report it to the authorities. Then they know stuff. They've been studying this. They know how to investigate. And so if it is a false claim, it usually is figured out quickly. It's not something that goes on and on and on. And usually those are in the ones that I'm seeing that happen are usually in like custody battles with parents, where one will accuse the other so that they could have custody of the child. So it's not usually a random child in a church that would make that kind of outcry. Also, just be if you talking about children again, if your child has an extreme change of behavior and there's no other reason for it, it would be good to get them some counseling and begin to ask some questions, because that was the number one that happened with me, and that's what I've seen over the years, is that that's one of the biggest indications that something is wrong.
Uh, you write on page 56, the church that represents Jesus Christ should be the safest and most restorative place on earth for those who have suffered any kind of abuse, but often it is not. And I sadly agree. The first thing I'd like to maybe ask you, coming out of that quote, is you referenced earlier with respect to your babysitter, framing her response in part as institutional protection of her daycare. And take it the same thing happens with churches, that when claims come forward, churches are often concerned about institutional protection. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. And we're seeing that in the Daystar scandal right now here in the US, where a child was abused by a family member and it was hushed and pushed under a rug. And we're seeing it all the time. It's very common. And the other common thing to happen is the church will try to handle it internally, and they'll do some really horrible work to re-victimize a victim. So they'll call the victim back into a church office. They will have the perpetrator and victim, and they'll tell the victim to forgive the perpetrator. I mean, it's just horrible. Or you'll go into a courtroom And you'll see if the person was a church leader, you'll see on the left side them being accused, all these people from church supporting them. On the right side, no one supporting the victim. And that is not how it should be, but that's the reality of today. I think part of that goes back to a false model of church as institution, because if you have an institution, you want to protect it. And then you're talking about this is all about money. But if your church does not revolve around this idea of building this behemoth of a structure, then it's easier to go to the authorities because you have nothing to lose. You're like, well, that's not what the church is. So what the church is protecting people from wolves and, loving people in their midst and being an ER for the people that have emergent issues. So this is what it is.
Yeah, I think that is it's so easy to think about the institute. We always say like, well, the church is the people, not the building, that kind of thing. But it's so easy to fall into the trap of protecting the building, protecting the assets, protecting
Mhm.
the reputation, rather than protecting the integrity and health of the community. And it's a fateful decision. You described, I mean, this is pretty sad, but you described just now churches often siding well, with the accused, with the perpetrator, with the respondent, rather than with the person who's brought forward allegations. You say on page 90, the abuser is protected by the church often and shuffled away, while the hard work of forgiving is demanded of the survivor. Can you talk a little bit about the expectations we place on a survivor of abuse for reconciliation, restoration with the abuser? We all have this sense, well, you should forgive. In an ultimate sense, yes, but how does that become toxic and harmful?
I like to say that no one gets to prescribe your forgiveness journey. And it is a very tender, just like healing is layers, forgiveness is layers. You could make a choice today to forgive, but 3 weeks from now, something's going to come up and you're going to have to choose to forgive again. But forcing someone to forgive because you have a very narrow view of trauma is detrimental. So I would just highly caution someone trying to be a good Christian person and saying you need to forgive. I would say first read a couple books on sexual trauma before you ever say anything like that, because it's asking the impossible. Now with the Lord, all things are possible, but that journey takes a very long time. And in the beginning stages of your trauma, when you're making your outcry, usually there's been years that pass between what happened and the outcry. So the outcry is making it fresh again. And then suddenly you're supposed to forgive immediately. Um, that is not simple. You hear like parents of murdered children. I've heard this before on, being interviewed, and they'll ask them, have you forgiven the perpetrator? And a lot of them will be like, I can't yet. And I think it was David Pittman who's an advocate, he said, rape is murder that left the victim alive. And we need to remember the depth of that trauma. And if it is hard for a parent to forgive someone who murdered their child, it is very, very hard for a sexual abuse victim to forgive that ruined my whole life. I am redeemed. God's done a great work, but I had complex trauma and almost every adverse childhood experience on the map. I wish that I didn't have that story. I'm grateful for Jesus, but goodness, forgiving those boys and forgiving my father, which is an even more complicated journey, has taken a lifetime.
Yeah. For years, for me, one of the most problematic parts of the Bible were the cursing psalms or the imprecatory psalms, where the
Mhm.
psalmist curses his enemies, wishes destruction upon them. But then I came to read them, like, because often people try to read them as a sort of baptism of cursing your enemies, that sometimes it's appropriate to curse your enemies. I've come to have a different view. To give you a quick illustration. So some years ago, there was a mother named Jennifer Neville Lake, and her three children were killed by a drunk driver named Marco Muzzo. And at the hearing of Marco Muzzo, after he was convicted, Jennifer Neville Lake says, "You deserve lose everybody you've ever loved.
Mm.
And when I think about that curse, it's an imprecatory curse against him in isolation, it's horrifying. How could you wish that upon somebody? When I understand it as the heart cry of a mother going through her own sense of loss and search for healing, it makes perfect sense. And I read the cursing Psalms in that light. These are people that are undergoing their own anguish and pain, trying to find their way forward. I
Yeah.
understand the end of the trajectory is love your enemies, Jesus says in Matthew 5. Doesn't mean we're going to get there today. So we
Yeah.
need to have grace on the journey. As we conclude, could you give a final word for anybody watching this who themselves may be a victim survivor of abuse? What would you want to say to them?
I would say first, you're not crazy. I hear you and I see you. You are not alone. This is a long journey. Please get help. You can't do it by yourself. You need community. You probably need counseling. um, there's a wide variety of ways that God heals us. One of them is that. Another is being prayed for by godly people and telling your story. Some people are carrying around an untold story, and I often will tell my audiences that that untold story will never heal. And so even if you're terrified to tell it, consider writing it down or speaking it into a recorded device and sharing it with one very safe person. And you don't have to do it all at once, but get it out of you, and that will be the first step toward healing.
Mary, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great.
Thank you. It's been my privilege.